We're here at the Alton VFW Post 1308 on May 6, 2008, and we're talking to Marion Ray, who was in the Battle of the Bulge, and we'll get to that. How old are you?
84.
84, okay. Where were you on Pearl Harbor, and how did you hear the news?
On Pearl Harbor Day,
Yeah.
I was at home. I was 17 years old. I was a senior in high school. And about 45 days later, I graduated from high school.
You graduated January
19.
Where did you go to high school at?
Alton High.
Okay. And then did you enlist or?
No, I was drafted by my friends and neighbors.
Okay. And then what happened next? Where did you go?
Well, we got notification to appear for a physical exam, and on March the 15th, 1943, there was a group of us went to Peoria, and we had physical exams, and those who passed the physical exam were sworn in, and then we were given 7 days at home for reporting. So 7 days later, we reported into Scott Field, and that was on the 22nd day of March, 1943. So after 3 days there, they loaded us onto a train, filled up the train, and we spent 2 days on the train, heading first east and then south. And as we went south, well, of course, they were saying keep the blinds down, and every time we'd stop, the blinds would go up. I'd look around. So guys are saying, what else can you do? We're in service, and you can't do too much else. We arrived in South Carolina, and we stopped first at a place, and some of the fellows were yelling at people, where are we at? Where are we at? And, you're in South Carolina. I said, is there a camp near here? And they said, oh yeah, Camp Croft. So we thought we were going to Camp Croft. Pretty soon the train started up again. And when it started up again, we figured, well, I guess we're going to Florida. We didn't go to Florida. We went to Fort Jackson, South Carolina. And we arrived there. It was the 106th Division. It was a new division, been activated. And we were, I guess, basically the last group arriving there. So the whole train load went to 106th Division. So as a result, there were about 25 of us from Alton. And so it was easy enough to identify different people because of the serial numbers. 3 6s were Illinois and Michigan, Wisconsin.
So this is Army.
Yeah.
And how long were you there then at boot camp?
Well, we were part of a division, so it wasn't actually considered boot camp. We went through basic training, we went through unit training, we went through regimental training, we went into what they called the D series. By then it was into late fall, into the winter months. And then in January of 44, they moved the entire division to Tennessee for the Tennessee maneuver area. And in Tennessee, where there were, I think there was 4 divisions. It was an airborne division and several other divisions as well as 106th. So for almost 3 months we were getting battle conditions and snow and the rain and whatever. So following the maneuvers, we were then reassigned to Camp Atterbury, Indiana. So we had an overnight trip. We stopped at Fort Knox, Kentucky, and then on up to Camp Atterbury. So those of us who were from the north were really happy to be at Camp Atterbury and rather than being down south. I guess because of so many troops and so many of the forts being in southern states, why they weren't too happy with all the troops being there. Mm-hmm. Like when we'd go into town on weekends at Columbia, which was the state capital at that time. Why Columbia wasn't too big, but on Saturdays and Sundays, all it'd be in downtown Columbia, it'd be troops going down one side of the street on the sidewalk, GIs going down, you'd cross over and come back up. So you'd spend a whole day going up and down the street, walking, going to a movie, getting something to eat. Whereas when we arrived at Camp Atterbury, the people were open and generous and welcomed us, and as a result the guys were dating the daughters, and there were many of the fellas that later married many of the young ladies from that general area, Indianapolis. So it was a great period of time. The only thing is that in the meantime, while they were hitting us for replacements to be sent over to Europe, the first time we got levied was at Fort Jackson, and the troops there, many of them went to units who were still fighting in Africa and into Italy. Once we arrived at Camp Atterbury, they levied on us, and they took about 2/3 of the infantry combat troops to go over to Great Britain to be replacements for the invasion. So in the meantime, those of us who were left there were receiving replacements. Well, at that time in 1944, all the divisions that were going over for the invasion and the troops, the divisions later, the replacements that we received were quite a few. They had a program taking place called the ASTP, where fellas in colleges, they had received basic training and then sent to college engineering programs and so on. So we got a very large number of fellas when they discontinued that program. And also during 1943, the Air Corps was expanding, and fellas were getting transferred to the Air Corps. And so they discontinued a lot of the pilot training programs, and those fellows were being sent back. They were rather unhappy. And the fellows from ASTP, they were quite unhappy. And then there were other non-combat units where they were breaking those up and they were sending them to us. So I was a squad leader, and in a squad of 7 men, I had 2 infantry basic men, and I had 5 who were other, like MPs and quartermaster and various anti-aircraft, coast artillery, things of that sort. So by that time, when our division was to go overseas, we really weren't, I would say, combat ready, but they sent us anyway. So because they were sending every division possible because of the width of the front in Europe. I mean, it was running from Switzerland to Holland. So they were sending every division that they could come up with, and so we were one of those. There were other divisions: 87th Division, 78th Division, 102nd Division.
So when did you get over there?
Well, we were sent in various groups because of ship capacity. We were sent to England, and the ship that I was on, the Aquitania, which was the 3rd largest troop ship, we went into Scotland and boarded trains and then went down into the Midlands of England. And my particular company was stationed at Banbury, which was a few miles away from Stratford-on-the-Avon.
Okay.
And and all the little towns down there, why there were different units there. So we were only there about 4 or 5 weeks. However, we were there long enough for Thanksgiving. But for Thanksgiving, another sergeant and I, we got 3-day passes along with a weekend, and we went to London sightseeing.
And how old are you at the time?
At that time, I was 19.
Okay.
Yeah. And so then when we got back, why, the word was there that we were being alerted to go on over to the continent. So we packed up everything that we had there and went to Southampton. From Southampton, why, we boarded various types of ships. Because my company was what they called a heavy weapons company. Within an army battalion, there were 3 rifle companies, there was a heavy weapons company, and there was a headquarters company. That headquarters company was kind of a mixture of different types of smaller units, anti-tank platoon and so on, intelligence platoon and so on. But I was in the heavy weapons company, and which was 30 caliber water-cooled machine guns and 81 millimeter mortars. So we had 2 platoons of machine guns and 1 platoon of mortars. So the fact that we had what was called a crew-served weapon, why, we also, each squad had a Jeep with a trailer. So our particular company, as well as some of the others, we went across the channel in it's called an LST, which the front of the ship drops down and you can unload the vehicles and so on. So our vehicles were in the ship that we were on. So when we got over to Le Havre, why, we had to go down the side of the ship into landing crafts and then motor on in. And then when they hit the shore, well, then they dropped the front down and we went in. So then we went up the embankment or up the area. And
okay, if I eavesdrop? So, Marion, is it okay with you?
What's that?
If I eavesdrop with you, if I sit here with you?
Oh, I don't care.
Okay.
So
Bob Hussman, the post commander, he's doing the interview.
Yeah, as long as he doesn't start talking. When he starts talking, then
Okay.
I don't talk.
So we landed there, and of course it was raining. Wars are never fought in good weather. It always seems to be bad weather or things are going on. So it was raining. And so they unloaded our Jeeps, and as they would bring the Jeep up, why, we'd get in, the driver would jump in, and my gunner and assistant gunner would jump in, and then I got in. So there'd be 4 in the Jeep, and then we'd go on down. So we were forming the convoy. And once the company was all there, why, then we drove into the night, and we motored for a while, and then we found a place where they designated that we would pitch our tents and stay overnight. And we went into a field, and as you walk, you were walking on grass, but you could hear the squishing because of the rain, the water and the grass there. So we had to pitch our pup tents, and that was no fun. A lot of the guys were trying to sleep in the vehicles and so on. So then the next day we started out, and we had no idea, where we were, because having arrived there at night. And so as we started motoring, why, we were trying to look for names of towns and so on. So finally, I recognized the name of one town, having read World War I history. So when I heard the name of that, I knew that we were headed for Belgium. And so when we got to Belgium, of course we had to stay overnight, and it was snowing. So most of us, we just, rather than to pitch a tent, we slept in the vehicles, sitting up or whatever. Each of our squads, we had been given what they called a squad burner, and it was a little heater stove, and it was in a container about that big around, and it was about that tall. So we had wrapped our shelter halves around the Jeep, and we had that burner going. So as we were driving along, why, it was warm. We began to take off some of the outer clothing. But then when we got into Belgium and the snow, we were glad that we had the little stove. And so another day later, we arrived at St. Vith, in the vicinity of St. Vith. And they said that was going to be division headquarters, but we would be moving on. But we stayed overnight there. So again, in the snow, so we were sleeping in the vehicles rather than trying to pitch a tent. My particular battalion was designated part of the division reserve. So there was a battalion from one of the other regiments and our battalion, which was the 1st Battalion of the 424th Infantry Regiment. So we were sent to an area which was right on the Belgian-German border. And the dividing line between Belgium and Germany was the Our River. And we were at a town by the name of Steinbruck. So we went into a house on the German side, and company headquarters and the kitchen was in Belgium. So for the next few days, and I say few days because of the thing that happened, we were writing letters home and trying to bypass our censors by saying somewhere in Belgium, somewhere in Germany. So my family never picked it up. And the odd part of it is that the delays that took place and the start of the Battle of the Bulge, as a result, why they heard more about the battle taking place, but they weren't sure that we were a part of it until word began to come back that our division was one of the first that the Germans hit. Our division replaced the 2nd Infantry Division, who had replaced the 4th Infantry Division. The 4th Infantry Division had combat-wise come up to that point. Then the 2nd came in and they built defensive positions and huts and so on. And so when we arrived, why, they were rather, if I can say it in French, they were a little pissed off. Because it was what they were doing, it was a defensive position. There wasn't any fighting going on. Occasionally they'd have patrols going back and forth. And so they were rather provoked that a green division was coming in and getting to replace them in this position, and they were being moved out and going to go to another area where they would be part of an attack that was to take place. Well, when our division took its positions, a normal defensive divisional front was 4 to 5 miles. Our division was spread out 24 or 25 miles. We had units online in defensive positions that couldn't even see, much less have verbal contact with the adjourning
So it was
units.
a thin line.
Huh?
It was a thin line.
Thin isn't the word for it. I mean, they'd have a unit here, and 2 or 3 miles away, they'd have another unit.
Okay.
Okay. Now, another factor that a lot of people didn't or still don't realize is that our division was in Germany. our division headquarters was in Belgium. Okay. Now, how long had Germany been Germany? 1,000 years, right? So they knew every street, every road, every tree, they had their own maps. So they knew Germany. And we were in positions in Germany, so they knew where we were. Now, we had to take off our insignia when we got there, while the Germans on the PA systems and playing the music and so on, they say, welcome 106th Division, and then I'd welcome 424th Regiment, or welcome so-and-so company. So, a lot of the things that take place, we have to laugh about them, because everybody was saying, oh, you can't do this, you can't do that, and all the time the Germans.
Secret from who?
Yeah, secret from who? Wasn't any secret from the Germans. Now, also, that part of Belgium had, the people there spoke German, because it had been part of Germany. In fact, Belgium at one time was part of Germany, part of France, part of Holland. So the thing of it was is that we were occupying in some of the units were occupying part of the Siegfried Line, the West Wall, backwards.
Okay.
In other words, the position was made to look west, and our guys were in those looking east. So it didn't work right. Okay? So all they were in those occupying them, but they had to make other arrangements in order to try to see the German. Now, when our division started replacing the 2nd Division, a colonel from our corps that we were assigned to was there with the regimental commanders, and they were inspecting the various positions and so on. And of course, the officers, the regimental commander, said, oh my God, these are terrible positions, we'll have to do it. He said, oh no, you can't change anything. Never heard of such a thing. You can't change anything. So, as I said, 25 miles, and you got troops occupying positions. So, a very good friend of mine who was in a company such as mine in one of the other regiments, we had 3 regiments, 422nd, 423rd, 424th. I was in the 424th. 1st Battalion, D Company, D Dog, 424th Regiment. So then other units of the division were, I'd say, mated up with an infantry regiment, forming a combat team. So, like the next one you're going to talk to is Jack Rain, who was we were in the same division. He was in an artillery battalion. So his battalion was part of a regimental combat team of the 422nd Regiment. Okay? So even the engineer battalion, which was actually a combat, what they called combat engineers. Those guys, might fight, and then they have to build. Well, we always thought of them just building, not fighting. But there were infantry fellas, and they had engineers in position, and artillery battalions in support of. So each division has 3 105 artillery battalions. So each one of those battalions is direct support of an infantry regiment. And then you have a general support battalion who had 155 millimeter long toms, and they were in general support of the whole division. Got it? Mm-hmm. Okay. We started replacing the 2nd Division on the 10th day of December, 1944. The Battle of the Bulge started December 16, 1944, 6 days later. So the morning of the 16th, the Germans started sending everything they could artillery-wise. And as I said, we were in Germany, so they had pretty good accuracy as they fired on the frontline troops. They also had very good accuracy for the others. Well, as I said, we were in Steinbruck, and Steinbruck was beginning of a mountainous area there, so everything was going over us. So basically, we didn't know what was going on. And finally, by the middle of the morning on the 16th, our company commander came to this house where we were quartered, and he said, prepare for a combat pack, told us what clothing, what to wear and so on. And he said, and get your weapons checked out, put them in the trailers and be ready. Which we did, and then very shortly I came in and he said, okay, mount up. So we mounted up and we started up the road, and it was like, well, we're going for a joyride. No, we were going into combat because the Germans had started, and at that point it was like 10 to 1, 10 Germans to 1 American. And so we started up this roadway, and the next thing we know, artillery started coming in, and what we were doing is that we had hit an area where the Germans knew that to get from Steinbruck to Winterspelt, you had it as open area, and they'd throw in artillery. So as we entered this area and artillery coming, the captain wheeled over to the side of the road and gave us a signal to dismount. And so we did, and into the ditches alongside the road. And funny thing happened. I mean, I rolled into what, I don't know if it had been some guy's slit trench or whatever, but I got this part of my body into the slit trench, but my legs were out of it.
And you're a tall man.
Yeah. Now, I didn't know and didn't realize, because it was so damn cold, that a fragment of one of the artillery rounds had hit my foot. Okay? So later on, I never knew or realized what had happened until I was in prison camp and beginning to warm up a bit. And when I took my boot off, my sock had blood there. And when I took the sock off, across my big toe, was like somebody taking a knife and slit. So, battle wound.
Yeah.
Well, the fact that we were in division, part of the division reserve, until the Germans were really pouring in on our other 2 battalions that were spread out. The assistant division commander just happened to be making his rounds and was with our regimental commander. And the regimental commander said, I've got to have my other battalion. You know, we can't handle this. One of the defensive positions was really being overrun. And so assistant division commander said, you've got it, okay? I'll notify the division commander. Again, what they did is that they had radio silence. So all communications was by sound-powered telephones. If an explosion came over and blew the line apart, then they had no communications. So those units who were out there, the fellows who were communications guys, wiremen and so on, were constantly running the telephone lines, checking to find out, you know, where they were apart or so on, and wire them back together and so on. So our battalion went up to a town called Winterspelt. That was not the front. The front was on up further, and the company that was up there was our regimental cannon company. And the cannon company was something that the Army had made a change somewhere along the line, and into each infantry regiment they added a cannon company, and they gave each regimental commander his own battery of 105 cannons. It was like a 105 howitzer, but it wasn't as powerful. Okay. Well, in order to get enough troops to fit all these positions, they took the cannon company, they took their cannons away from them, they took machine guns away from us and from others, and they put cannon company up as a defensive position. They really weren't. They were prepared to fire artillery pieces, not, but they were basically infantrymen, so that's what they got. One of the positions that our regiment, in our regimental area, was our division reconnaissance company. Now, they were just supposed to be the eyes and ears of the division. You know, they would seek out the enemy. They would get reconnaissance, intelligence, and so on. So they were dismounted, and they were in a little town out in the front, 2.5 miles away from the nearest company, which was Cannon Company. So it was really a screwed up mess.
I was going to say, it sounds like a mess.
A lot of books have. I don't know. I'm just guessing. I have a tremendous library of books about the Battle of the Bulge. Okay, I've got 2.5 bookcases of books, and when the battle started, you know, the Germans, they didn't have They didn't have to come right at defensive positions, but they did. That's the thing I can't understand. Why did they attack up in some other areas? They just went between them. Okay, and as a result, when they pushed through that area there, they were into and able to get behind 2 of our regiments. So 2 of our regiments were captured, not intact. I mean, some of them were able to get away, but rather than, since the Germans had them surrounded and they were getting fire from front and back, and there was armor, vehicles and so on firing, the regimental commanders made the decision that they would surrender. They were out of ammunition because when they went in, all that we received was what they called the basic load. And once the basic load was expended, they had no way of getting reinforced because they were surrounded and they were out of food. And so they surrendered to 2 regiments. So those 2 regimental commanders, as time went by, at least after the war and so on, they crucified them because they surrendered men. And so both of those men, colonels, stated that when they realized the sacrifice, if they had the regiments going ahead trying to fight, that the Germans would have wiped them out. So as a result, we lost 2 regiments. Well, my regiment, being on the southern edge of the 3, was able to pull back without us, though. I mean, because the town that we were trying to defend, the Germans got into it. And when they took this one little town of Grosslangenfeld, where the division reconnaissance company was, they could come right down a little road and right in behind us. So they were behind us, and my machine gun stopped firing, and the my platoon leader said to me, "You and Sergeant Moe," who was my section sergeant, 2 squads and then a section sergeant. And he said, "Take your gun back in that remains of the house back there and see what's wrong with your gun. Repair it." It could have been repaired right there in place. But he said, "Take it back there." Okay. So I took the gun off the tripod and started crawling back, and Sergeant Moe grabbed the spare parts kit, and so we went back into this house down in the basement. And so we got down there and I started tearing it apart because I thought I knew what it was, and it was a broken firing pin, or the head space was not right. So he was handing me the parts and I was putting it back together. And about that time, the platoon sergeant come sliding down through the basement window, and he says, "Put that gun over out of the way, get the hell out of here. The Germans are all around here." So he went back out through the window, section sergeant went out through the window, and I went out through the window. So we were then along a blacktop road with a ditch, and there was a hedge. So we went down this. Now, our positions were up here. And so he got to an opening into the hedge, and so then he went through. Well, what we had been trained, don't gang up. So Sergeant Moe was waiting for him to get through and get away from the edge there. And I was close to him, but not right at him. And the next thing we heard was, "Hands up!" Looked up. Now we were down in the ditch. And I looked up, and there's two Germans standing there, guns pointed at us. Now, in the book, I've said that in those, and I call it milliseconds, through my memory, brain, vision, every World War I movie that I had seen as a kid went through. Now, Dan Brandon, the editor of the Telegraph, who assisted me on this, he was the guide. I wrote it, and he read it and asked me questions and made corrections and so on. He said, "What were your thoughts?" And I said, "First of all, I was scared to death because I didn't know whether he was going to shoot us or not. And the first thing that he did is that he ran his hand in here and he pulled my watch off. And then he hit me here, and I had a sea ration package in my field jacket pocket. So he took that. So, you know, it kind of is down. By them doing that, then your thoughts kind of change somewhat. But yet, we didn't know. I didn't know, speaking for myself, as to whether they were going to shoot us or not. Now, there's been a lot said about German orders from up above down various units as to whether they would or would not take prisoners. Now, at Malmedy, I guess you read about that, which was right near us. They didn't take any, they took prisoners and then they shot them. So we didn't know of that, but yet when they started walking us up into the center of Venderspelt to a church that was there, and I saw other prisoners, then we knew, or we felt more confident, that they weren't going to shoot us. Well, now, my thoughts could have been completely wrong when you think about what happened in Malmedy, because they had those prisoners and they were in this area and they shot them. So in that period of time, first scared to death, you don't know whether you're going to live or die, and then as the time went by and circumstances of them moving us and so on, then we became a little bit more confident, okay, that we weren't. But it's a hell of a feeling of knowing that you're a prisoner, but you don't know what's going to happen. You know, it's like a big steel door suddenly comes shut and locked, and you're thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen next? So when we got up to the church, I recognized one of the fellows who was a good friend of mine, good buddy. He had lived in his family was living in St. Louis. They were originally from down southwest Missouri, but because of the war and jobs and so on, his family moved up to St. Louis, his mother, and I don't know what had ever happened to his father. I only knew that his mother, and he had 2 brothers in service and a sister, but they were living in St. Louis. So when we were at Camp Atterbury, every time, because of circumstances, when I'd get a pass, I'd check to see that George Hurley would get a pass, so we'd come back to St. Louis together on the train. So he'd go home there in St. Louis, and I'd get on the interurban and come over the electric streetcar. And then going back, I'd go back over to St. Louis. We'd meet at the train station. We'd go back to Camp Atterbury. So here's George Hurley. He's the only one I ever knew that had 2 middle names. George Clint Truman Hurley. And George was also our guidon bearer. And you know what a guidon bearer is? Okay.
No.
He's the guy up in front that you see him carrying a little flag.
Okay.
Okay, that's your guidon, because it designates your unit. So he's the guidon bearer, and he sets the pace. I mean, his step, you know. George was about 6'2", and real nice fellow. So we were friends even after the war. He came to Alton quite a bit, and I'd go to St. Louis until he met the young lady that he married, and that marriages changed circumstances. Well, anyway, we were taken prisoner, and George was there, and so as they put the group together, they had, you know, a couple of Germans with guns, you know, holding us together. But artillery rounds were coming in, and winter spell not being very large, as we heard the artillery, why we said, we were whispering to each other, if the rounds come in, get close, that's when we're going to bust out of here, we're going to take off. You know. But the artillery round stopped, so we didn't get that opportunity to break loose. So they started walking us, and so we walked part of the night, spent the rest of the night in a church, and then the next day we continued walking. Later, when we went through a town by the name of Prum, and it's odd, in 1999, a group from our division association went back over to Europe and Belgium and Germany. And we stayed in a hotel in Prum. So here we are, we're walking through Prum, and it was really, had been torn apart by artillery. We really did a lot to tear the place down. As we were walking through the town, while the Germans were throwing, kids and old men were throwing rocks at us. Well, nothing you can do, you know, you can just try to protect yourself. And so we got out to the edge of town, up on the, we were going kind of up a hill, like, and at the edge of town, there was a woman, and she was throwing carrots at us. So we didn't know if she was throwing them to us or at us, but we were picking up the carrots and eating them. And because we hadn't eaten anything since breakfast the day before. And so they continued walking us to a little town called Gerolstein, where they put us into a warehouse. And when I went into the warehouse, I looked around, there was my platoon leader. And I couldn't imagine how he got there. I thought I was taken prisoner before he was, and there was my platoon leader. So, you know, we got to talking and trying to find out what's going on. He said, I don't know what's going on any more than anybody else. I think that was the really biggest trouble with the whole thing, is that the communication system, you know, radio silence and so on, there was no communications. Nobody knew what the hell was going on. And when you read about the Battle of the Bulge and you read about Eisenhower, Bradley, Patton, and so on, they were going to have a little party for Eisenhower because he'd been promoted to 5 stars. And so Bradley wasn't upset. He just thought, well, the Germans are, because they figured the Germans couldn't do anything. And the intelligence was zero, zilch, awful. And all of the intelligent people kept saying, no, the Germans, they can't do it. They haven't got the ability to put things together, but they did. And so they, that was a big thing, that everybody who was captured was trying to say, what the hell is going on? What is taking place? Because, you know, all the talk that was going on was, hey, it looks like the war will be over and very shortly. Because, you know, it was approaching Christmas 1944. And everybody's saying, well, you know, Germans can't do much more, they'll have to give up. But they didn't give up, you know, they had to go all the way to Berlin. So then the next day they load us into the famous European boxcars. What they call 40 and 8 during World War I. 40 men and 8 horses, or so they would load 65 men into one boxcar, and that means you can't sit down, you know, if you want to. You made arrangements to do it. But anyway, they loaded us into the boxcars, and our next stop was Stalag 12A, Limburg, Limburg. Limburg was a prison camp collecting point. And as they unloaded us out of the trains and walked us to the prison camp, when you look at a prison camp, there's barbed wire, and you look at that gate and you think, oh my God, I'm going to be a prisoner. You know, that's when it really hits you, because then you see the outside of this prison camp. So in the prison camp, well, you know, here's all these guys, and everybody's saying, what went on? Who are you? You know, what unit were you in? The evening of December 23rd. Now, a lot of guys from our outfit, our division and so on, they'll still say, oh, Christmas Eve. It was the night of December 23rd, and I documented it in there. The British came over and bombed the railroad marshalling yard, and they used what they called Pathfinder bombing where a lead plane would go over and he would be the navigator, and okay, he would spot that, and he's going through, and then there are planes behind him which would drop parachute flares, okay, and so he would say this is the path, and so they're dropping the parachute flares. Well, that was the worst winter in 50 years, they said. And it was windy and cold as hell, and maybe it was snowing and maybe it wasn't. I don't remember now. And the flares, the wind was blowing the flares, so it blew the flares over into the residential area of Limburg as well. And the prison camp is up there. So the bombers came through. And they each had one bomb, so-called practice bombing, this whole flight. They bombed the railroad yard. I have pictures, and there's pictures in here of it. They bombed the railroad yard. There you are.
Okay.
They bombed the railroad yard. They bombed the houses. There were later on, and I have a part dedicated to 40 years after the bombing. The newspaper wrote and those pictures were in the newspaper article that one of the fellows got. And there was 168 civilians were killed. Bombs hit one barracks in the prison camp holding officers. My platoon leader and a platoon leader from the 3rd platoon were there and were killed in the bombing. Now, they told us later when we had to go up, different details had to go up and help pick out the remains and bury them, and the Germans, they wanted to clean up the thing, tidy up, you know. So details, they would take them out of the various prison, the barracks. They said 63 officers had been killed. Well, that was only because nobody really was in charge, and the Germans didn't care that much. But in the book, I got a hold of enough material. I found that there were 45 officers killed. There were 15 officers lived through it, of which 5 of them weren't even wounded, but 10 of them were wounded. So 10 and 5, 15 lived. And there were 3 enlisted men in the barracks. They must have been interpreters or whatever. They were killed. So that was on the night of December 23rd, about 6:10 p.m. when the bombing started. So we were in these buildings, and the Germans had, I guess you'd call it insulation in the ceiling. We thought it was a mixture of straw and mud that had been pressed together, and it was in the ceiling. And that was falling as the buildings were shaking, and it was hitting guys, and the guys, I'm hit. The next morning, you couldn't find any guy who admitted that he. Now, that was the night of the evening of the 23rd of December, on Christmas Day. Horrible feeling. I mean, here it is, Christmas. And the Germans, they didn't give a damn, about us, Christmas. We didn't get any more to eat on Christmas Day than any other day. Well, so there in the building that we were in, the guys would get up and we were forming a circle, and as more would come up, the circle would get bigger. So we were holding hands and trying to sing Christmas carols from memory, and I guess there were some good church members, they were leading us to it. And so then each one, would say a prayer or some little something. And so I'm standing there holding the hands, and I look across the circle, and I recognize someone. And his name was John Hickey from Alton, drafted at the same time I was in the same group. He was in the engineer battalion, okay? I told you that maybe they fight him. Well, when we broke up, and as I say in here, I made one of the dumbest questions as you can make. I walked over to John and we grabbed each other and I said, "Johnny, what are you doing here?" Hell, I knew he was a prisoner, okay, but I didn't anyway at that time. And think about engineers being up to where they were being taken prisoner. You always think about them back there building a road or building a bridge or doing something or other back there, okay? But they were up on the lines, the same as us, okay? So, John, what are you doing here? Well, the Germans divided. They separated the officers from the enlisted men, and they separate the non-commissioned officers from the privates and PFCs. Now, in accordance with the Geneva Convention, officers don't work, non-coms don't work, privates and PFCs can be made to work. Okay. Now, they also separated the Jewish boys. Okay. So we had one Jewish boy in our one that I was good friends with, Philip Rosenthal from Chicago. And so when we saw Philip, when they were registering us, why the guys were saying, "Hey, listen, when they ask you what your job was, tell them that you were a cook or a baker." And the Jewish boys, don't tell them that you're Jewish, they'll separate you. Well, Philip was one of these kind of guys. He says, "I'm Jewish." So he told him he's Jewish. Well, later on, years later, we found out that by them separating the Jewish fellas, there was one group of them that were pulled out of one of the prison camps, and they were forced to dig a mine back in the mountain, and the Germans were going to put the factories underground. So, and those fellows got no more rations than those of us who weren't working. They were shipping out to privates and PFCs. They would go to camps where they would be assigned out on work parties. A fellow from our division by the name of Vonnegut.
Yeah.
Is his name familiar?
Yeah.
He wrote Slaughterhouse Five. He was from our division. The fellow right now who is the president of our 106th Infantry Division Association was also in that group, Slaughterhouse Five group. And so there were about 150 of them, and they had to go into Dresden after the fire bombings and go into the houses trying to recover the bodies and so on. The fact that I was a non-com, George and I, we did our best to stay together. So they put us on a train and we went 5 days in boxcars, freezing weather, 65 men in a car, one little window up there. The only way that you could relieve yourself was some of the guys had been able to hold on to their steel helmet. And so you would either urinate or defecate into the helmet. And so we found there are things that you do as a prisoner that there's nothing they can do about, because what the hell, you're already a prisoner. Right? So instead of dumping it out through that window, we would wait until the train stopped. And that was the big thing about German trains. They would go and stop, go and stop, go and stop. Pull over the siding, train would go by, back up, go on. Stopping and going all the time, okay? So when the train would stop, then the German guards who were in a car would jump down off the car and come running down, checking the door, sliding door, to make sure that we were still inside, okay? So as the Germans would come running down, and so we learned German profanity. So we were on those boxcars 5 days. When they put us into the boxcars, they gave us two little cans. They're about the size of a Campbell's soup can, a small, okay? Inside one can there was 5 little cheesecakes, round cheesecakes, with cream cheese inside of the yellow cheese outside. And the other can was a can of hardtack. The last 5 days. And they told us, 5 days. Well, now, how can you take a starving man and give him 2 cans of food and say, it's got to last you 5 days? Okay? So, now, through the International Red Cross, the Swedes and the Swiss, various, like the American Red Cross, British Red Cross, and so on, would put together parcels of food and then turn it over to the International Red Cross, and by their ships they would get it into German ports, and those parcels of food had any number of things in there. A little can of maybe stew, or potatoes and meat and potatoes, or eggs and bacon, various things there. And then there'd be like a can of powdered milk, and a can of meat paste, and various things that they could get into a parcel. Well, the Germans would never hand the prisoners a parcel. They're too smart for that. They'd make the men share it, and they'd punch holes in the cans, because originally when they would give them those, the guys would store them up and then try to escape and use those as food. So the Germans would punch holes in them. Also, there were American cigarettes in there, and believe it or not, American cigarettes were better money than gold. The Germans loved American cigarettes, so you could trade. Well, there were also French prisoners, and the French prisoners were out on work parties, and a lot of them were able to trade with the civilians or work in a bakery, and they'd get a loaf of bread for 1 cigarette, okay? To bring it back, and they'd sell it to dumb Americans who were starving for 5 or 10 cigarettes. Then they started getting greedy. They wanted a package of cigarettes. Now, that's when you wanted to kill the French. Well, in these boxcars, there were guys who were smokers, who were willing to trade food for cigarettes. I didn't smoke. George Hurley was one of those who smoked. Okay? So when we would get 2 or 3 cigarettes with our ration of soup, I would keep my cigarettes and then I would trade them to somebody for food. And I always shared it with my buddy. Okay? So here we are in this train. I had some cigarettes. George, he didn't have any cigarettes. He smoked his. So as the thing went along, believe it or not, along about the 4th day, there were some guys who still had cheese. Mm-hmm. And so I would trade cigarette for cheese or hardtack. And I would break it in half and give George half of it. Well, on the last day, I had 2 cigarettes left. And George knew that I had 2 cigarettes. And I traded 1 cigarette for a guy, he still had some cheese. And so I got the cheese and I broke it in half. And George says, "Why didn't you give me that cigarette?" And I said, "I'm giving you half the cheese." He said, "I want the cigarette." So I pulled out the one last cigarette and I gave him the cigarette.